Focusing on the topic that I think is very, very important, which pertains to life in two languages. This topic can be studied by psychologists from very different perspectives. But because I am a cognitive psychologist from my training, I focus specifically on cognitive underpinnings of that experience. And I want to share today with you some pieces of what we have been investigating. Let me start by asking you, how many of you are actually bilingual? Can you raise your hand if you're bilingual? Yeah, I can see some people are hesitating to raise their hand. I guess it really depends on the definition that you take, but I can assure you that really majority of this room raised their hand. So really, that reflects the state of affairs in the world. Most people in the world are bilingual. This is somehow a cartoon, a cartoon displaying, depicting in a sarcastic way how monolingualism can be viewed nowadays as really illiteracy of the 21st century. So most people are really bilingual today, and this has tremendous consequences. So it has many practical consequences in education and in diagnosis. We're not going to talk about this today, but I can assure you that there are a lot of practical challenges that needs to be considered while we take that perspective into account. There are also a lot of important consequences for theorizing in psychology in general, or at least there should be consequences for theorizing in psychology, and specifically in cognitive science. Now, surprisingly, even though we know that most people are bilingual, most models in cognitive science take a very simplistic assumption of a monolingual human. Okay, so most models of cognition so far have been focusing on monolinguals. Now this is changing, and there is really more and more recognition of the fact that bilingualism is a norm, and models and theories needs to include that and take that into account. But there is also more and more understanding that bilingualism can actually be also seen as a window to study cognition. Now, this change of attitudes towards bilingualism can also be seen in this graph that shows an upsurge of research on bilingualism and second language learning. So you can see how big the growth of number of research articles we have seen. Okay, so this is really the 2 time points between my first encounter with Lancaster, okay, so 1992 up to 2016 this time, but I can assure you that this number grows with every year. And you can see how rapid this growth is. Now, this change in attitudes have been also noticed by other, but it can be also demonstrated by other means. So, for example, a very prestigious journal, Science, have acknowledged the importance of that topic of bilingualism by indicating that and identifying that understanding the biological basis of second language acquisition is one of the 125 questions that scientists need to explore in the next 25 years, and that was in 2005. So we still have 10 years more to go to really understand the phenomenon. Okay, so my goal for today is to demonstrate very quickly how we can capture that experience of life in two languages in lab settings, okay? And moreover, what we can gain from this experimenting for our understanding of the phenomenon of bilingualism itself, understanding of the cognitive system more generally, and also understanding the implications of outside of the laboratory, okay? So given the very serious time limitations that I have, okay, I only have 30 minutes and I really want to stick to this, so not to bore you too much. I'm going to focus on only one particular line of research that we've been pursuing in my lab, okay, which pertains to an experience that I'm sure it's not completely unfamiliar to at least some of you. And this experience is quite well, I think, depicted on this picture, okay? So being abroad for 2 months, forgot my native language. So anyone who have experienced speaking a second language, using a second language or another language for some time, is familiar with this feeling of difficulty to return to their own language, okay? And I can see some nodding faces, okay? So we study that experience from, a scientific point of view and really want to understand the basis of that experience. So some of the questions that we've been asking are the following. How long does it take to forget your native language? Is everyone equally vulnerable to that loss? Or what are the neural correlates of that experience? So really trying to understand the mechanisms behind it. So these 3 questions are going to be the basis of the 3 examples, research examples that I'm going to share with you today. But before I do so, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the very generous support that we have received in the past from various funding sources that graciously support our research. But mostly, I want to thank the many wonderful people with whom I've collaborated on various aspects of that topic. And I also want to say that I'm heavily indebted to the pioneers of research on bilingualism, who I have been very fortunate to work in the past. And these are Judy Kroll, Ellen Bialystok, and David Green. And really, many of the ideas that I'm going to share with you today stem from various work that I've done with them. So before I dive into the specifics, I want to also say that the topic that I'm going to share with you today, the experiments that I'm going to show, have been conducted by these members of my lab, research group, Jakub Szewczyk, Patrycja Kałamała, Agata Wolna, Joanna Durlik, Alba Casado, both postdocs and graduate students in my lab. So let's now take a trip to Poland. Welcome to our lab in Krakow. Okay, this is our group, and this is our lab, and I'm going to destroy this in just a moment. Okay, so just imagine that you are a participant in one of the experiments that we are doing, okay? So you're here, sitting in the lab, okay, in the lab booth, looking at the screen, okay? And we show you some pictures, and all you need to do is to name these pictures as quickly as possible, okay? So there is a mic, okay? And you smile and you say the word that you see, okay, that corresponds to the object that you see. If you're lucky, we also put a cap on your head and measure the electrical activity of your brain, but not everyone will be so lucky. So, are you ready? Yeah? Okay. So, prepare yourself, okay, and please name the objects that I'm going to show you in your native language. So it's going to be interesting because I'm sure there are many different languages. And let's just engage and embrace in this cacophony of different languages, okay, that are possible here. So just say out loud, okay, in your native language, what you see on the screen. Ready, steady, go. Okay, very good. So, okay. So now, can you please name the object that you see in the second language from your repertoire, okay? So whatever it is for you, okay? Ready? Okay, very good. You were hesitating several times. Okay, and now back to Polish. Oh, no, not Polish necessarily. Back to your first language, okay? I'm very egocentric, as you see. Okay, so now back to your first language, okay? 3, 2, go. Very good. Okay, thank you. This was great. You just had a feeling of how it is to be a participant in one of the many experiments that we run. And the experiment that you participated in consisted of 3 blocks, okay? So naming in your first language, naming in your second language, and then naming in the first language again. Now, please note that each time you name completely different pictures, okay? Now, what we are interested in is the comparison between this situation with this situation, or rather this situation with that one, okay? So what we want to explore is the naming, the retrieval effort that we make in retrieving words in our first language after we were just exposed to naming in our second language, okay? Completely different pictures, but still a different language in which you need to name them, okay? So in the 3 experiments that I'm going to show you, we always use the same procedure. We compare the critical condition with the baseline, okay? So in the first experiment, we ask how long does it take to forget your first language, okay? See that the forget here is in the quotation marks because we don't really look at the forgetting itself, but the difficulty of retrieval, okay? So in that study, we had 88 Polish-English bilinguals whom we tested in Poland. They varied in their level of second language English proficiency. And all they have to do was naming pictures, just like you did a moment ago, with this exception that they named a lot of them, okay? So this was the procedure that we used. So each block represents a block of naming. So they started with the first language, then they had another block of language naming in L1, and then they had to move to L2, which was English for them, and then back to Polish, okay? Now, as I told you before, the critical comparison was this, okay? These 2 blocks. So what happens when we name in our first language just after naming in the second language, and then compare it with the baseline in which we name in our first language after naming in the first language, okay? So in each block, which lasted about 5 minutes, okay, we showed participants 60 completely new pictures, okay? And as I told you before, we measured response latencies, or response times, in other words, RT for short, okay? With the assumption that the time that it takes for people to retrieve a word from memory is an indication of the effort that they need to make, okay? So here's the graph in which you will see the main result, okay? So here is the reaction time, okay? So the higher, the worse, okay? The longer it takes us to retrieve the words. And here are the 2 conditions which we compare, okay? And look at the results. You see the difference, right? It's a strong effect, okay, of 100 milliseconds difference, okay, between the 2 conditions. Now, you might be sitting there and thinking, okay, 100 milliseconds, what is it, okay? But for a brain, okay, 100 milliseconds, it's a lot. And if you consider that this is for one individual picture at a time, you know, you add 100 milliseconds to another, and it really creates a huge difference, okay? So it's very remarkable that this increased difficulty of retrieving words in the first language after producing words in the second language can be obtained after only 5 minutes of exposure to the second language. Okay? Isn't that remarkable? I was shocked to see these results. Okay? And I can also tell you that we replicated this effect many times by now, so it's not only one single finding, it's also quite consistent with other findings in the literature. Okay? So what we are doing now, we are trying to ask at least some of the many questions that a scientist can ask in that situation. So how much of the second language is enough to create such a drastic effect? Okay? Perhaps just intention to speak a second language will create similar cost. Does the way that we use the second language, okay, so do we produce, do we generate words, or we just comprehend, like you are listening to me right now, would that be enough? And also, how permanent is this retrieval difficulty that we observe here? So how long does it last? Okay, so these are just examples of some of the questions that we ask. And one important that we also keep in mind, and we also study that in a different project that I don't have time to tell you about, is how this effect can actually translate for this feeling of language loss, which is so familiar to many people who live abroad. Okay. So the critical question that we try to address is to understand mechanisms. Okay. And the question we ask ourselves is the slowdown due to the blockage that the first language receives after being exposed to the second language? So is it possible that the second language really blocks access to the first language? Okay. So what is the underlying mechanism? So in the literature, there have been suggestions that the critical mechanism that plays a role here is inhibition. Essentially, the idea is that each language that we have in our language network has a certain level of activation. And typically, the first language has a higher level of activation than a second language. Okay? So there is a difference in activation between them. And in order to use the weak language, what our cognitive system needs to do is inhibit the language which is the strong one. Okay? So you see it here symbolically presented as, you know, a pressure that is going down to suppress the strong language to allow the weak language to be spoken. Okay? So under this account, the difficulty of retrieving the first language after being exposed to the second language is due to a global language inhibition mechanism that is taking place. Now note I mark here global, the word global, because it doesn't relate to a particular set of words. We just seen that this effect can be observed when you name completely different pictures. Okay? So it suggests that our entire language network, entire lexicon, is affected. Okay, so a natural step, next logical step that one could take is to ask, in order to understand the nature of this process, is to ask whether these effects, detrimental effects, can be observed for everyone to the same extent. So is everyone equally vulnerable to suffer this type of language slowness? Okay? So in order to explore this, we decided to investigate the individual differences in language balance. Okay? So I think that everyone can intuitively think, you know, or feel that people differ in how balanced language users there are, okay? And the idea is that a language balance can also be assessed by looking at levels of activation of the two languages. So when the levels of activation for each language are similar, then you are more language balanced when there is a big discrepancy. And we took that step, okay, to explore that. We needed to make some assumptions, and we made an assumption that a proxy for level of language activation is a default time to name pictures, okay? You can argue with that assumption, but this is the assumption that we make, and it's important because in the graph that I'm going to show you, on the x-axis, what we have here is exactly this measure, okay? So here we measure language balance, or we show the language balance, which is really measured as a difference between the second and the first language, okay? The difference in speed of naming in baseline conditions, okay? So these were conditions which were unrelated to the task that you saw people were performing. Okay, so the most important thing is that you understand that on this axis, if you are on the far left, you're close to 0, which means your languages are equally activated, okay? If you are to the right, then it means that you're strongly first language dominant. That means that your activation of the first language is much stronger than the second language, okay? Now, on the y-axis, we again have response latencies, but now in the critical condition, so in these two conditions that I showed you before. So in when first language naming happens after first language, or when it happens in this critical condition after second language, okay? So you will see in a moment two lines, okay, blue and red, and the idea is that the bigger the difference between the lines, the larger the effect. That means that your first language is more affected, okay? When there is a small difference between these two lines, there is really nothing that is affecting the first language. Do you follow? Okay. Okay, so excited. Here are the results, okay? So you see the two lines decreasing, okay? That's important. I'm going to comment on that in a second. But what you probably see as well is that the biggest difference is here, and then towards the left side, the difference between the two lines is much smaller, okay? So what does it tell us? It tells us that people who are mostly affected by the second language are the ones who are the strongest in their first language, okay? So those who are less balanced, so they are first language dominant, their first language is really strong, okay? They're the ones who are affected by the second language the most, okay? Now this seems a little bit counterintuitive when you think about it. How come, you know, if you're strong, how come is the effect so strong on you? But if you take the perspective of the model that I showed you before, the inhibitory model, okay, that story makes perfect sense. Because it suggests that if you have a strong activation, strong competitor, okay, you need to put a lot of pressure. You need to use a lot of inhibition to allow for the weaker language to be used, okay? So the effect is the biggest in that case, okay? So it makes sense. So because we are interested in understanding mechanisms, we could conclude that the people who are using inhibition, okay, to allow for the second language to be spoken are the ones who are less balanced, and then the balanced people who are here are not using this inhibition, at least not to the same extent. But I think it's not the end of the story, because you can probably see another important element in that graph, and that is that people who are on this side of the graph are much higher here, okay? So if you're balanced, if you're language balanced, you're slower in your first language to begin with, Okay? So more balanced people are generally slower in their second language. So for us, if we go back to our model, okay, it would, if we should say that this corresponds to the unbalanced group, so, okay, to people who are unbalanced. And for the balanced people who have similar activation of the two languages, yes, they probably need a smaller amount of inhibition to use the other language because the difference between the activation levels is smaller. But at the same time, look, these people have higher activation of the second language than these people, yes, okay, the red bar here is higher, but at the same time, the bar here is much lower, okay? So it means that for balanced people, the activation level of each of their language is relatively smaller, okay? So to sum up, when languages differ in their activation, more inhibition needs to be applied, but in balanced bilinguals, we observe reduced activation for each language. Now, what is the source of this reduction? We don't exactly know, but I think that we could clearly test further whether it indicates actually that all bilinguals employ inhibition. There are just different indices of this inhibition. So for one, it will be the difference in naming time, okay, and the difference in the magnitude of this L2 after effect. And for the balanced people, it will be generally higher response latencies, response time, or the time to retrieve words. Okay. Now, what we also do is we try to understand the neurological basis of these effects or neurocognitive process behind this type of L1 slowdown that I showed you just a moment ago. And to do that, we look at two sources of evidence. One is event-related potentials, so recording the electrical activity of the brain. And the other source is looking at the functional neuroimaging and functional localization of these effects. Now, this second one is really a new project that we are developing, so this is work in progress. I won't talk about this at all, but I want to focus for a few minutes on the event-related potentials. So here the question is, what are the neurocorrelates of this L1 slowdown? Okay, and to investigate that, we employed event-related potentials, so really with the aim of tracing changes in the electrical brain activity during picture naming. So here again, we use the same paradigm, the same design as I showed you before. So the comparison is between this and this, okay? And what are the results that we get? Okay, so here is the graph that depicts the best the pattern of results that we keep finding, okay? So what we find is what we would call and identify as a frontal-central modulation, okay? It's frontal-central because it's happening in the front and the center of the brain, okay, here, okay, depicted by these frontal electrodes and mostly central electrodes, CSEP, okay? And this modulation between the two conditions, so the moment where the two lines, okay, the two waves diverge for the two conditions, as you see, they diverge here mostly. This modulation happens in this specific time window, okay? So this type of modulation has been identified by us as the modulation corresponding to N300 component. I don't know how many of you have ever encountered your peer research and this type of component specifically, but let me just say that, you know, it's clear from the graph that you're looking at that the amplitude of this component, which is a negative going wave, okay, and let me just tell you that here in the ERP research, we very often depict negative up and a positive down, and this is exactly how this graph is presenting. So this negative wave that is going up is increased in our critical condition, okay? So this increased N300, we are observing this increased N300 in that condition, okay? What does it mean? Now, our current interpretation is that this effect points to the decreased activation of the first language in the condition following the second language, okay? Now, it's to be discussed, okay? But we base this understanding on other research from outside of bilingual literature, just focusing on the monolingual research, in which this similar component, okay, that you can see here is frontal-central. It has a negative going wave, can be observed in a related but different type of situations. And that can be most generally identified as situations in which we have a violation of goal-oriented action, okay? What do I mean by this? I will just show you a piece from the design that people have used in the past to look at this type of manipulations and in which they observed the very effect. So look, if you were a participant in that type of experiment, you could be asked, is this an everyday life situation? And you are shown a short video clip that shows people, a person reaching for a board, okay, like a cutting board, okay, and then place a piece of bread on the board, on the chopping board, and then they are presented with one of the two pictures, okay? So as you see here, hopefully everyone can see from a distance, one situation is completely congruent with our life experience, okay? So using a knife to cut the bread, whereas the other one is completely ridiculous, okay, absurd, and it shows a person ironing the piece of bread, okay? So in our experimental world, we call this type of situation incongruent or incongruous, and we know from other people's research that this type of incongruency, or in other terms, violation of the expected goal, of the expected action, produces the same N300 component, okay? So we could say that this N300 component shows or demonstrates the pre-activation of the lexical semantic network, okay? And on the basis of that, our conclusion from our research is that this increased N300 demonstrates reduced activation of the first language network, okay? So in summary of the three examples that I gave you, what we observe in our research is that even a short-term active exposure to the second language can lead to really massive, given you know the scale that we are looking at, massive retrieval difficulty of the first language. The reduced language activation can be successfully observed on the neural level, okay, via the component that a modulation of the component that I showed you just a moment ago. And finally, our conclusion is that evidence of language inhibition is present both for unbalanced bilinguals and balanced bilinguals, but we need to look at different indices in each case, okay? So in essence, everyone, if you're bilingual, is impacted by the use of the other language. So here's the model that we are working on right now, in which essentially the current second language use is affecting, or it's calling for inhibition of the first language. And this inhibition of the first language is affecting the L1 activation. Now the scope of the inhibition is a function of the default difference between the first and the second language, okay? Now, importantly, the presence of this inhibition, okay, can change the default level of activation of the first language. That will then impact the difference between the two languages, okay? So we are currently testing this model using different type of parametric designs, and I'm not going to talk about this today, but let me just conclude that what we have been trying to demonstrate is that our native languages are not like a rock, okay? They're not like a rock of Gibraltar, okay? That is standing there and has been standing there since ever, okay? They are quite changeable, okay? So our language system is very permeable. It's vulnerable to different sorts of changes that can happen, okay? And different forms of experience. And this dynamics needs to be taken into account and accounted for theoretically. Now, it also shows, I think, that our cognitive system in general is very flexible, as we know from other domains of cognitive science inquiry. But this is another piece that adds to this understanding of the very flexible human cognition. Now, I've been telling you about the projects that are looking at the mechanisms underlying the language use in bilinguals. But we, in the past and still currently, we've been also looking at the consequences that might be or might not related to the use of these mechanisms. So we've been investigating for several years now, what are the consequences of bilingualism that go beyond natural consequences like, oh, I can speak to more people because I know other languages. But there are much more exciting consequences that can be only observed in laboratory, and we've been looking at that and possible connection between the two. But this is really a topic for another meeting, so I'm not going to talk about that. But let me end by saying that we have another project that is actually carried out 2 hours from here in Edinburgh, in which we look at the Polish immigration, just like many of you guys, and how their first language changes, not only with respect to the speed with which people retrieve words, but also syntactically and pragmatically. So we try to explore this phenomena on various levels. And related to this, we still need participants. So if you would like to pay a visit to Edinburgh, okay, and you're willing to pay for the visit for the train ticket yourself, okay, you're more than welcome to participate, okay. We do pay for the participation in the experiment, but not from transport from Lancaster. So perhaps you know someone who would qualify and would be interested in participating. Please let them know and let me know as soon as possible, because we need to finish the project and we are still collecting more data. And I also want to take a moment to tell you that we are about to open a call for a new postdoc position in our lab, so that will look into mechanisms of this language control underlying language use in bilinguals, looking at the functional neuroimaging. So if you know anyone, okay, please let them know and let me know as well. And finally, I just want to thank you, and I also am open for questions. So.